There is a version of World War I that lives in monuments. It lives in the clean stone of memorials, in the amber light of Remembrance Day ceremonies, in the phrase "the war to end all wars," which was never actually believed by the people who coined it. That version of the war is organized around sacrifice, around valor, around the idea that men went into something terrible and came out either heroes or honored dead. That version of the war is not what this is about. What this is about is what happened between the monuments, the long unlit stretches of weeks and months where nothing heroic occurred and where the only thing soldiers experienced was a grinding, mechanical existence that slowly replaced everything human in them with something harder and quieter and more difficult to name. What this is about is the routines, the procedures, the standardized responses to situations that no human being should ever have needed a standardized response to. Because one of the most disturbing truths about the First World War is not that it was chaotic, it is that it was organized. It is that men adapted. It is that institutions developed protocols for things that should have caused those institutions to collapse entirely. And instead, those protocols became policy, and policy became culture, and culture became the kind of normal that young men carried home inside them and never fully spoke about again. The Western Front ran for approximately 700 kilometers. It stretched from the English Channel coast in Belgium down through northeastern France to the Swiss border. Along that line, at its peak, there were roughly 3 million men living underground. Not metaphorically underground, literally in the earth. In systems of trenches that were dug by hand and by machine, reinforced with timber and sandbags, connected by communication trenches and support trenches and reserve trenches that ran parallel to each other, like the layers of some enormous subterranean city. That city had its own geography, its own language, its own economy, its own medicine, its own relationship to time, and it had routines. It had deeply embedded, thoroughly normalized routines that soldiers performed every single day, not because anyone had sat down and designed a humane system, but because the alternative to routine in that environment was psychological dissolution. The first routine, and perhaps the one that most efficiently communicates the character of the war, was the morning stand-to. Every morning before dawn, every soldier on the front line was required to stand at the fire step of his trench with his weapon ready. This happened regardless of weather. It happened in rain and in mud and in frost. It happened when men had been awake for 30 consecutive hours. It happened when men were sick. It happened in the deep winter of the Somme, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the mud in the trench froze solid overnight and then thawed into something closer to wet concrete by mid-morning. The stand-to lasted roughly an hour. Then officers would inspect rifles. Then rum would sometimes be distributed. Then men would return to whatever they had been doing, which was usually either attempting to sleep in a space that was not designed for sleeping or performing one of the other routines that filled the remaining hours of a frontline day. The logic behind the stand-to was military. Dawn and dusk were considered the most likely times for enemy attack, because low light provided cover for advancing troops. So at those times, the entire line had to be ready. The logic was sound. The effect on the men who performed this ritual every day for months and sometimes years was something the logic did not account for. Standing in darkness, weapon in hand, waiting for an attack that most mornings did not come, was not simply tiring. It was psychologically corrosive in a very specific way. It rehearsed fear. It made the body and the nervous system practice a state of extreme threat response on a daily basis, and then asked those same bodies and nervous systems to stand down and function normally. Over time, the rehearsal and the reality became difficult to distinguish. Men who had performed the stand-to hundreds of times began to carry that readiness inside them as a permanent condition. They could not turn it off. They did not know how to turn it off. The British Army did not have a protocol for turning it off. It had a protocol for stand-to and a protocol for stand-down, and nothing in between that addressed what happened to a man's nervous system after months of performing both. The second routine was the management of the dead. This is the one that tends to be treated most carefully in popular histories because it is the most immediately disturbing, but the disturbance it caused to the men who performed it was not the visceral horror that later audiences might assume. The disturbance was subtler and in many ways more serious. It was the disturbance of normalization. Because in the trenches, the dead were not removed quickly. They were not always removed at all. The nature of trench warfare, with its constant artillery bombardment and its no-man's land that was genuinely impassable during active fighting, meant that bodies accumulated in and around the trenches and could not be safely retrieved. Over days and weeks, those bodies decomposed. They became part of the landscape. Men ate their meals near them. Men used them, in some documented cases, as physical supports for trench walls. Men walked past them every day on their way to and from the fire step. The smell of decomposition became a background constant that soldiers stopped consciously registering after the first few weeks. This is documented in letters, in diaries, in the medical records of men who were later treated for what was then called shell shock, and what we would now recognize as a complex trauma response. The normalization of the presence of the dead was not a moral failure on the part of individual soldiers. It was an adaptation. The human nervous system will normalize almost anything if exposure is consistent enough, and the institution of the British Army and the French Army and the German Army understood this not as a problem to be solved, but as a feature to be managed. There were burial details. Men were assigned to collect and bury the dead when conditions permitted, which was not always. The burial details kept records. The records were important because pay had to be stopped when a man died, and personal effects had to be catalogued, and next of kin had to be notified through a system of form letters that were filled out by clerks in offices far behind the lines who had never seen the thing they were documenting. The form letters were standardized. They expressed regret in language that had been approved by the War Office. They did not describe the circumstances of death in any detail that might cause distress. This was policy. The policy was not designed to protect the families, although that was how it was framed. It was designed to prevent the kind of information from circulating in civilian society that might undermine the willingness of further men to enlist or to continue supporting the war. The gap between what the form letters said and what had actually happened was enormous and was known to be enormous by everyone involved in producing them. The third routine was the management of rats. The trenches of the Western Front had a rat population that was, by any measure, extraordinary. Estimates vary, but some contemporary accounts describe trench rat populations in the millions along the full length of the line. These were not the relatively small rats of peacetime environments. They were well fed. They fed on the same things that produced the smell that soldiers stopped registering. They grew large. They were bold. They did not flee from human presence the way rats in other environments typically do, because human presence was constant and the rats had learned that it posed no particular threat to them. Men woke up with rats on their faces. Rats chewed through the leather of boots left unattended. Rats destroyed food supplies and contaminated water sources and carried disease. The management of rats became a routine that soldiers engaged in during the long hours between stand to and whatever the day's assigned work was. They used bayonets. They used clubs fashioned from wood. They organized informal rat-killing competitions because the alternative to organizing the experience was simply experiencing it, and simply experiencing the presence of millions of large rats in the space where you also slept and ate was not something the human mind could sustain without some kind of structuring narrative. The competitions gave the rats a function. They became an adversary. They became something that could be managed and counted and compared. The soldiers who killed the most rats were sometimes admired for it. This was not irony. This was the war. The fourth routine was the daily artillery. Not the major bombardments that preceded large offensives, which were events of a different character entirely, but the routine daily shelling that both sides maintained more or less continuously throughout the war. This was harassment fire. It was designed to prevent the enemy from moving freely, to destroy supply lines, to crater the ground so thoroughly that any advance would be physically difficult, and to keep the men in the opposing trenches in a state of constant low-level stress. Which it did. The sound of artillery became the constant background noise of frontline life, in the way that traffic might be the background noise of a city. Men learned to categorize shells by sound. They could tell from the pitch and rhythm of an incoming shell roughly where it would land. This was a survival skill that developed without formal instruction, because the men who failed to develop it died more frequently than the men who did. And the men who survived long enough to become experienced soldiers passed the knowledge informally to newer arrivals. You learned to hear the difference between a shell that would land close and a shell that would land farther away. You learned which sounds required immediate action, meaning throwing yourself flat or into a dugout, and which sounds could be ignored. This calibration of response to threat became so refined in experienced soldiers that they performed it automatically, without conscious thought, the way a driver in heavy traffic monitors the behavior of surrounding vehicles. The problem was that this calibration did not turn off when soldiers went on leave. Men on leave in London or Paris flinched at sounds that civilians did not register. They threw themselves to the ground in response to backfiring vehicles. They could not sit in rooms where they could not see the exits. Their nervous systems had been recalibrated by months of exposure to an environment where the wrong response to a particular sound meant death, and that recalibration was not reversible in the 2 weeks of leave that the system provided. And when those men returned to the front, the recalibration deepened. And when those men eventually came home for good, if they did, they carried it with them as an invisible wound that the institutions of the time had no language for and no protocol to address. The fifth routine was lice. Every soldier on the Western Front had lice. This is not an exaggeration or a generalization. It was universal. The conditions of the trenches, the inability to bathe regularly, the wearing of the same clothing for extended periods, the sharing of blankets and sleeping spaces made lice infestation an absolute constant of frontline life. The soldiers called them chats, which is where the English word chatting comes from in the sense of casual conversation, because the daily ritual of sitting with another soldier and methodically running the seams of your shirt through a candle flame to kill the lice eggs, or picking the lice out one by one with your fingernails, was a social activity. It was something you did together. It was a form of grooming in the precise biological sense, the kind of mutual grooming behavior that primates engage in as a social bonding mechanism. Except that in the trenches, it was also a medical necessity, because lice carried trench fever, which was a debilitating illness caused by a bacterium transmitted through louse feces entering the skin through scratched bites. And trench fever was responsible for removing a significant number of men from the line throughout the war. The British Army eventually developed a chemical treatment for lice, a powder that could be applied to clothing and skin, but it was partially effective at best and did not solve the underlying problem, which was that the conditions producing lice infestation were the conditions of the trench system itself. And the trench system was not going to change because it was the war. The medical records of the war contain an interesting entry that recurs across different armies and different sectors of the front. It describes soldiers presenting with what physicians of the time characterized as a kind of flattened affect, combined with an inability to describe their own symptoms. Men who came to medical stations with obvious physical complaints, rashes, infections, hearing damage, were unable or unwilling to articulate what was wrong with them in the way that patients in other contexts typically could. They had lost or suppressed the language of physical complaint. They had been in an environment where complaining about physical discomfort was a social liability, where the culture of the trench explicitly devalued the expression of suffering, and they had internalized that devaluation so thoroughly that they could no longer perform it even when it was medically necessary and socially permitted. The physicians noted this. Some of them wrote about it with something that reads like clinical frustration. The soldiers were not being deliberately uncooperative. They had simply lost access to a part of themselves that the civilian world assumed would still be there. The sixth routine was the relationship to food. Rations in the trenches were supplied through a system that was, on paper, reasonably designed. Men were supposed to receive bread and canned goods and occasionally fresh meat. And in the early part of the war, the system functioned more or less as designed. As the war extended and the logistics of supplying millions of men in the field became more complex, and as the agricultural output of the affected regions declined, the quality and quantity of rations declined as well. Men ate food that had been transported over heavily shelled roads and through communication trenches that were regularly under fire, which meant that hot food was rarely hot by the time it arrived, and that the containers carrying it sometimes arrived damaged or contaminated. Men supplemented their rations by foraging and by purchasing food from civilians in the towns behind the lines when they were rotated out of the front. On the front itself, they ate whatever arrived, and they ate it in conditions that would be described, in any other context, as completely incompatible with the maintenance of basic health. They ate near the smell of decomposition. They ate with hands that could not be properly cleaned because water was a limited and tactically managed resource. They ate in dugouts where rats had been the night before. They ate biscuits that were so hard they broke teeth, and they ate the broken pieces because the alternative was not eating. The British Army issued a daily ration of bully beef, which was canned corned beef and hard-tack biscuits and tea, and this basic ration became so associated with the experience of the war that for many veterans the smell or taste of these things was a trigger for the entire sensory memory of the front for the rest of their lives. The seventh routine was the management of mental breakdown. The British Army's approach to what it eventually, reluctantly and partially acknowledged as shell shock evolved over the course of the war in ways that reveal a great deal about the institutional priorities of the time. In the early years, mental breakdown was treated as cowardice. Men who exhibited the symptoms we would now recognize as acute stress response or post-traumatic stress disorder, trembling, inability to speak, paralysis, hysterical blindness, uncontrolled weeping, were court-martialed in some cases, or sent back to the line after minimal rest in others, or simply ignored and left to function as best they could in a state of profound psychological distress. The pressure on officers to keep men in the line was constant and institutional, meaning it came not from individual cruelty, but from the logic of a system that had calculated the number of men needed to hold a given length of trench and was not prepared to reduce that number for reasons it classified as psychological rather than physical. The distinction the army drew between physical and psychological wounds was not a distinction the human body recognizes. A man whose hands shook so severely he could not hold a rifle was as incapacitated as a man with a broken arm, but the institutional response to the two conditions was entirely different, and the social response within the unit was also different, and men knew this, and it created a secondary layer of suffering on top of the primary one, which was the condition itself. Men suppressed symptoms. They performed functionality they did not possess. They went through the motions of soldiering while operating in a state of psychological crisis that was invisible to the institution because the institution had decided it was invisible, and the men cooperated with that decision because the alternative was social ostracism, the loss of the unit bonds that were in many cases the only thing keeping them functional, and in some cases court-martial and execution. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during the First World War for offences including desertion, cowardice, and murder. Many of these men, in retrospect, were clearly in the grip of profound psychological illness. The executions were conducted according to military procedure. A firing squad of 12 men was assembled, some of whom were given live ammunition and some of whom were not, so that no individual soldier could be certain he had fired the killing shot, which was a psychological accommodation designed to manage the impact of the execution on the executioners, which is its own kind of revealing detail about how the institution thought about the psychological welfare of its soldiers. The men who were executed were buried in the same military cemeteries as the men who had died in combat, and their deaths were recorded as deaths, and the families received the same form letter expressing regret in approved language. The eighth routine was listening posts. Because artillery could not reach everything, and because the enemy was close, sometimes close enough to hear conversations in the opposing trench on a quiet night, both sides maintained a system of listening posts in no man's land. These were positions dug or constructed forward of the main trench line, close enough to enemy positions to provide early warning of any advance or raiding party. The soldiers assigned to listening post duty went out at night, alone or in pairs into no man's land, and lay still for hours, often in water-filled shell craters, listening. They could not move significantly because movement created noise and noise invited fire. They lay in the dark and the wet and the cold and listened to the sounds of the enemy and the sounds of the decomposing landscape around them, which had its own sounds. And they performed this duty on a rotating basis that meant it was a regular feature of frontline life rather than an exceptional event. The psychological effect of hours of motionless, silent exposure in no man's land at night, surrounded by wire and craters and the remains of previous occupants of similar positions, was something the rotation schedule did not account for. Men came back from listening post duty, changed in ways that were difficult to articulate and that their peers recognized without being able to name. The ninth routine was the rotation system itself. British soldiers on the Western Front were rotated between the front line, the support line, the reserve, and rest billets behind the lines on a schedule that varied by unit and by conditions, but typically involved spending somewhere between 4 and 10 days in the front line before rotating back. The rotation was designed to prevent the complete psychological and physical collapse of the men in the line. It did not prevent complete collapse. It managed the rate of collapse to a level that was compatible with continued military function. The men who rotated back to rest billets did not rest in any meaningful sense of the word. They were subjected to inspections and training exercises and working parties that kept them occupied, because the institution had determined, not entirely without evidence, that idle men developed thoughts and behaviors that were not conducive to military discipline. The rest period gave them access to estaminets, which were the small cafes and bars in the French and Belgian villages behind the lines, where they could drink and sometimes engage with the local population, and briefly experience something that felt like civilian life. And this brief experience was both necessary and insufficient, and everyone involved knew it was insufficient, and no one in a position to do anything about it did anything about it. The 10th routine was the treatment of gas casualties. Chemical warfare was introduced to the Western Front in April 1915, when German forces released approximately 168 tons of chlorine gas near Ypres. The initial Allied response was improvised and inadequate, and several thousand men died or were seriously injured in that first attack. Within weeks, the response had been systematized. The British Army developed a gas alarm system, which was essentially a series of horns and bells, and in some areas suspended artillery shell casings that could be struck to produce a loud metallic sound, and developed a procedure for responding to a gas alarm, which involved putting on a gas mask within a specified number of seconds. The gas mask procedure was drilled until it was automatic. Men could put on their masks in the dark, in the rain, while already in a state of physical exhaustion, in approximately 6 seconds. They practiced this regularly. They practiced it as part of the stand-to. They practiced it during training exercises. They practiced it until the physical memory of the action was as automatic as breathing, which is the appropriate metaphor, because the alternative to getting the mask on in time was not breathing, or breathing something that destroyed the respiratory system, or breathing something that produced blisters on all mucous membranes, including those of the lungs, which is what mustard gas did. And mustard gas was introduced in 1917 and was particularly difficult to manage because it was heavier than air. Settled into low areas, including shell craters and dugouts, persisted in the environment for days, and could penetrate clothing and cause chemical burns on skin without the soldier necessarily being aware of exposure until hours later when the burns began to develop. The gas casualty wards of the Western Front hospitals contain some of the most detailed medical documentation of the war because the injuries were distinctive and thoroughly studied. And the documentation is worth reading not for its content, which is precise and clinical, but for its register, which is the register of a medical system that has accepted a category of injury as a routine feature of the environment it is operating in and is focused entirely on managing outcomes rather than questioning the conditions producing them. The physicians who treated gas casualties were not indifferent to suffering. They were competent and in many cases deeply committed to their patients. But they were operating within an institution that had normalized gas warfare as a feature of the conflict, and their documentation reflects that normalization in its vocabulary and its structure, and its confident assumption that the injuries it is describing will continue to arrive in the numbers they have been arriving in and will need to be processed according to the procedures that have been developed to process them. The 11th routine was communication with home. Soldiers on the Western Front were permitted to write letters to their families, and most of them did so regularly because the letter home was one of the few points of psychological continuity with the life they had left and the life they hoped to return to. The letters were censored. This is well known. What is less well understood is the degree to which the censorship shaped not just what soldiers could say, but what they could think about saying, and through that, what they could think. The censor's role was officially to prevent the transmission of militarily sensitive information, positions of units, planned operations, details of fortifications. In practice, the censorship also functioned to prevent the transmission of information that might undermine civilian morale or military recruitment, which included descriptions of the conditions of the trenches, descriptions of casualties, descriptions of the gap between official accounts of the war and the reality of it. Soldiers knew this. They developed a kind of internal censorship that operated before the formal one, a learned self-editing that removed from their letters everything that the system had taught them was unsayable, and what remained was a heavily mediated version of their experience that bore the same relationship to reality as the form letter expressing regret bore to the actual death of a soldier. Some soldiers wrote two kinds of letters: the letter for the censor and the letter that expressed what they actually needed to say, which they carried on their person or gave to men they trusted to deliver informally outside the official postal system. Some of these uncensored letters survive. They are not literary documents. They are not articulate expressions of psychological distress in the way that the poetry of Siegfried Sassoon or Wilfred Owen is. They are usually short and fragmentary and written in the register of a man who is not accustomed to writing about interior states and who is attempting to do so anyway because the interior state has become too large to contain. They say things like, "I do not know how much longer I can keep going." They say things like, "Tell mother I am well when I am not well." They say things like, "I think about home every moment and the thinking about it is the only thing keeping me here." They are not dramatic. That is what makes them what they are. The 12th routine was the management of trench foot. Trench foot was a medical condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions. It resulted from the feet being constantly wet and unable to dry, which caused the tissue to begin breaking down in a process that, in severe cases, led to gangrene and amputation. In the early years of the war, trench foot was a significant source of casualties, removing men from the line in numbers that the British command found operationally problematic. The response was to make trench foot prevention a formal military responsibility. Officers were required to inspect the feet of their men regularly and to ensure that men changed their socks, that foot grease was applied, that men dried their feet when conditions permitted. The inspection of soldiers' feet became a routine duty of junior officers, performed alongside the inspection of rifles and equipment. Officers were held responsible for trench foot cases in their units, in the same way that they were held responsible for discipline and readiness. This is a remarkable institutional development when you consider it clearly. The Army had developed a system in which the direct cause of the medical condition it was trying to prevent, the conditions of the trench system itself, was not subject to change, and the solution was to make individual officers legally and professionally responsible for managing the symptoms. The individual soldiers' feet were a command responsibility. The trench system that was destroying those feet was not. The 13th routine was the use of alcohol and other substances. The British Army issued rum rations on a regular basis, typically before major actions, but also as part of the general management of morale in the line. The rum ration was not incidental. It was an official part of the supply chain, carefully managed and jealously protected, and its absence was a matter of genuine grievance among soldiers who had come to depend on it as one of the few reliable pleasures of frontline life. Beyond the official rum ration, soldiers obtained alcohol by whatever means were available during rest periods, and the consumption of alcohol in the towns behind the lines was a significant feature of the rest period economy. Some soldiers used other substances. Cocaine and morphine were available through medical channels and through unofficial channels, and the boundaries between medical use and non-medical use were not rigidly patrolled in an environment where the entire medical system was overwhelmed and where the distinction between managing pain and managing the psychological state required to continue functioning was not always clear. The German army had schnapps rather than rum, and its own supply chain, with its own specific character of disruption and deprivation, and its own soldiers developing their own set of adaptations to conditions that were, in their essential features, identical to the conditions on the Allied side. The German trenches were more elaborately constructed in many sectors, built with a longer-term logic in mind, because the German command had decided early in the war that holding captured territory was the strategic priority, and had invested accordingly in the permanent infrastructure of occupation. The German dugouts in some sectors were deeper and more extensively fitted than their Allied equivalents. This meant that when the British and French artillery barrages that preceded major offensives fell, the German soldiers who survived them had survived them in somewhat better conditions than the men who had been living in more improvised structures. It did not mean that they were not under artillery. It did not mean that they did not have lice and rats and trench foot and the accumulated psychological weight of years in the same ground. It meant that their specific version of the routines described here had a slightly different physical texture. The routines themselves were the same. The 14th routine was the relationship between officers and enlisted men. The British Army of the First World War maintained a class structure that it brought with it from the civilian society that had produced it, and that structure shaped every aspect of life in the trenches in ways that are difficult to fully convey without understanding the degree to which British society of the period was organized around hierarchies of birth and education that were understood by almost everyone within them as natural and permanent. Officers were predominantly drawn from the upper and upper middle classes. They had been educated at public schools that explicitly trained them for command roles, for the exercise of authority, for the maintenance of composure in the face of difficulty. Enlisted men were predominantly drawn from the working class. They had been educated, if they had been educated at all, in elementary schools that explicitly trained them for obedience, for the acceptance of authority, for the discipline of industrial labor. The trench system reproduced and reinforced this division. Officers had separate dugouts, separate messes, separate rations, and batmen, which were assigned soldiers functioning as personal servants. Enlisted men had none of these things. The physical proximity of the trench system, where officers and men occupied the same few hundred meters of ground and were subject to the same artillery and the same gas and the same rats, did not dissolve the class distinction. It made it stranger. It created a situation in which men who were separated by an enormous social distance were also separated by a physical distance of sometimes a few meters, and both distances had to be maintained simultaneously. And the effort of maintaining the social distance while the physical distance collapsed was an ongoing feature of frontline life that both officers and men performed without being fully conscious of performing it. Some officers were deeply concerned with the welfare of their men and managed the power differential with something close to genuine care. Some were not. The documentation of the war contains both. What the documentation does not contain is much evidence that the institution itself had any mechanism for distinguishing between them at scale, because the institution was not designed to assess the quality of the relationship between officers and men. It was designed to assess the military effectiveness of units, and military effectiveness was measured in terms of ground held, prisoners taken, casualties inflicted, none of which were indicators that said anything directly about what it was like to be a soldier under a particular officer's command. The mortality rate among junior officers was significantly higher than the mortality rate among enlisted men in the British Army of the First World War. This was partly because junior officers led from the front, literally, meaning they were expected to go first when their units went over the top and to be visible to their men at all times during an advance, which made them both models of the behavior they were demanding and primary targets of the enemy responding to that behavior. The junior officer class was decimated in the first years of the war, and the replacements who came through the officer training system as the war continued were younger and less experienced and drawn from a somewhat broader social base than the pre-war officer class had been, because the social base that produced traditional officers had been reduced by attrition to the point where the system could not sustain its own exclusivity. This produced a cohort of young men who had been given authority without the traditional preparation for it, and who were expected to exercise that authority in conditions that the traditional preparation had not contemplated. Many of them did not survive long enough to develop the competence that experience would have produced. The ones who did survive long enough became the experienced officers who trained the next wave of replacements, carrying the institutional knowledge forward in the same informal and incomplete way that experienced enlisted men carried it forward among their peers. The 15th routine was the handling of the mail. Mail from home was the most important non-military supply that reached soldiers on the front. The postal system serving the British forces on the Western Front was an enormous operation, processing millions of letters and parcels every week. Parcels from home contained things that the military supply system did not provide. Food that tasted like food, cigarettes, books, small personal items of no military significance whatsoever that represented the persistence of a life outside the war. The arrival of mail was one of the reliable moments of elevation in the otherwise flat emotional landscape of the front, and the non-arrival of mail was correspondingly distressing. Men who did not receive letters when others around them did felt the absence as something more than simple disappointment. It touched something about their standing in the world, their existence in the minds of people who were not here, their persistence as a person rather than a soldier. Some men did not have anyone at home who wrote. Some men had families that were unreliable correspondents. Some men had families that had been told not to write about anything distressing, and had interpreted this instruction so broadly that their letters contained nothing of substance, which was in its own way distressing to receive. The postal censors read the letters from home, as well as the letters going out. The fear was that information about civilian conditions, about industrial unrest, about the actual state of opinion regarding the war in the population it was allegedly being fought to protect, would reach soldiers in ways that would undermine their willingness to continue. In the later years of the war, when food rationing had been introduced in Britain, and when the public mood had shifted significantly from the enthusiasm of 1914, the letters from home carried information about a civilian world that was also experiencing its own version of institutional management of distress, its own version of the gap between official narrative and lived reality. And the men reading those letters in the trenches could recognize the management even from inside it. The 16th routine was the practice of raiding. Trench raids were small-scale nighttime operations in which groups of soldiers, typically between 10 and 30 men, crossed no man's land to attack enemy trenches. The stated purpose of raids was intelligence gathering, capturing prisoners who could be interrogated, destroying fortifications, killing enemy soldiers. The actual purpose of raids was more complex and more revealing. Raids were a way of demonstrating aggression and maintaining what the military command called an offensive spirit in units that were otherwise engaged in purely defensive trench holding. The command was concerned that extended periods of static defense made men passive and risk-averse and less willing to attack when ordered to attack, and raiding was designed to prevent that passivity. The logic was not unreasonable from a narrow military perspective. The effect on the men who were raided and the men who did the raiding was considerable, because raids were among the most purely dangerous activities of frontline life. They occurred in darkness, in terrain that had been reduced by months of artillery to a cratered wasteland of mud and wire, against an enemy who was alert and armed, and who had his own wire and his own alerts and his own prepared positions. The casualty rate on raids was extremely high. Entire raiding parties were sometimes killed or captured. The men who survived raids sometimes described them, in letters and diaries and later interviews, as among the most intense experiences of their lives, a description that psychiatrists who later worked with veterans recognized as related to the phenomenon in which extreme danger becomes its own form of psychological dependency, a condition that occurs when the nervous system has been conditioned to function at a certain level of threat and finds lower levels of stimulation insufficient. That conditioning accumulated over months and years of frontline service. It did not have a treatment. The 17th routine was the management of boredom. The Western Front, for all the violence associated with it in the popular imagination, was characterized for most soldiers on most days by profound, comprehensive, grinding boredom. The vast majority of a soldier's time was spent in waiting. Waiting for rations, waiting for the stand-down, waiting for rotation, waiting for orders, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the war to produce the decision that would end it. The waiting was not empty. It was filled with the routines already described. Stand to maintenance, work parties, inspections, the physical tasks of keeping the trench functioning. But the waiting was also mental. It was the waiting of a mind that had been removed from the contexts that normally gave it meaning and placed in an environment where the only context was survival and military function. The creative and intellectual and social capacities that men had brought with them from civilian life had very little to work with. Some men read voraciously whatever they could obtain. Some men wrote. Some men gambled. Some men developed elaborate craft skills, carving objects from shell casings, creating what later collectors would call trench art, which is a category of object that encompasses everything from carefully engraved brass vases to small sculptures to decorated cigarette cases, all produced with found materials in the intervals between the routines. The making of these objects was not incidental. It was a form of psychological survival. It was the mind asserting something about itself that the institution had no use for and no category for, asserting that there was a person here who made things, who had something to express that was not expressible in military terms. The British Army ran a newspaper called the Wipers Times, which was a satirical publication produced by soldiers themselves in the Ypres sector, and which was remarkable primarily for its tone, which was dry and ironic and darkly comic in a way that was entirely at odds with the official communications about the war that were being produced by the same institution. The Wipers Times made jokes about the mud and the rats and the lice and the artillery and the staff officers behind the lines who issued orders from a considerable physical and experiential distance from the things those orders described. It was tolerated by the command, perhaps because suppressing it would have been more revealing than permitting it, and perhaps because the command understood at some level that the psychological release it provided was performing a function that the institution could not perform directly. The men who read it and laughed at it were performing an act of psychological survival that the institution had not designed and could not take credit for, and which was, in its small way, a form of resistance to the management of reality that the institution otherwise maintained with considerable thoroughness. The 18th routine was the management of newcomers. Every unit on the Western Front was constantly receiving replacement soldiers to fill the gaps created by casualties. These newcomers, fresh from training, arrived in the trenches knowing the formal procedures, but not knowing the accumulated practical knowledge that experienced soldiers had developed over months of exposure to the specific conditions of that specific section of the line. They did not know which parts of the trench were most dangerous, which were the times of day when German snipers were most active, which sounds indicated incoming fire that required immediate cover, and which sounds could be ignored. They did not know the interpersonal dynamics of the unit, who was reliable, who was not, which officers would actually share information, and which officers would give orders without context. They did not know the specific geography of the sector's no man's land, or the specific peculiarities of the German unit opposing them. All of this knowledge was possessed by the experienced soldiers, and some of it was transmitted informally, but the transmission was inconsistent and incomplete, partly because there was no formal mechanism for it, and partly because experienced soldiers had developed a kind of emotional economy around new arrivals that protected them from investing too heavily in men who might be dead within days. This sounds callous. In the context of the front, it was practical. Men who had watched multiple waves of newcomers die before they had learned enough to survive, had learned not to form attachments to newcomers quickly. This was a psychological adaptation to a specific kind of repeated loss, and it was also a form of institutionalized cruelty, even though no one designed it or enforced it. It emerged from the conditions the way the rats emerged from the conditions, as a consequence of an environment that had certain properties and that humans adapted to in certain predictable ways. The experienced soldiers had a category name for new arrivals in many units. The names varied by nationality and regiment, but the function was the same. The name marked the newcomer as someone who did not yet know what the experienced soldier knew, and the marking served as a protection, because to know someone as a newcomer rather than as a person was to hold that person at a psychological distance that would be less painful to cross if that person died before becoming a person in the fuller sense. This is not how the experienced soldiers would have described it. They would have described it, if they described it at all, as the way things were done, as the natural order of things in that environment, as simply the reality of the situation, which it was. It was the reality of a situation that the institution had created and maintained and had never examined for its human cost, because examining the human cost of the situation was not among the institution's functions. The 19th routine was the act of returning from leave. This is perhaps the least discussed of the routines, because it does not involve violence or disease or physical suffering in the obvious ways that the others do. But it is in many ways the most psychologically revealing. When soldiers returned from leave to the front, they crossed a threshold that many of them described in terms that are consistent across accounts from different armies and different nationalities. They described a moment of re-entry into the reality of the front that was experienced as a kind of suppression of everything that had been briefly reactivated during the leave period, everything that connected them to the life they were not living, in preparation for the reassumption of the front-line self, the adapted, narrowed, hardened version of themselves that could function in the environment they were returning to. The journey back from leave was documented by many soldiers as the most psychologically difficult part of the leave process. The arrival at the front after leave was described as worse than the arrival at the front for the first time, because the first arrival had been cushioned by ignorance and by the narrative of adventure that many young men had brought with them from civilian life, and the return arrival had no such cushion. There was nothing to believe in except the knowledge of what was coming, and the knowledge of what was coming, combined with the brief re-exposure to what had been left behind, created a form of grief that was exact and private and unacknowledged by the institution. The institution had a protocol for returning from leave. It involved reporting to a specific location by a specific time. It involved having one's papers in order. It involved the formal reassumption of military status and the resumption of one's place in the rotation. There was no protocol for what happened inside the men who performed these steps. There was never a protocol for that. The war produced approximately 10 million military dead and 20 million military wounded, and those numbers were processed through a bureaucratic system of extraordinary efficiency that recorded names and dates and cause of death and regimental numbers and pay status and next of kin information, and almost none of that system had any component designed to address the question of what it was doing to the men who were still alive and still in it. The paperwork was meticulous. The accounting was precise. The system knew exactly how many men it had, and exactly how many it was losing, and exactly how many it needed to replace them, and it obtained those replacements with consistent reliability until November 1918, when the German government requested an armistice and the shooting stopped, and the men in the trenches were told that the war was over. The men in the trenches were told that the war was over, and many of them received this information with something other than the jubilation that the occasion seemed to call for. The accounts of the armistice from men who were in the line describe a range of responses in which relief is present but complicated, in which the silence that followed the cessation of artillery fire was experienced as disturbing rather than welcome, in which men sat with each other in the trenches they had lived in and could not immediately understand what the absence of the war meant for them. Some men wept. Some men were quiet for a long time. Some men were unable to eat the celebration meal that was organized. Some men, in the days following the armistice, were found to be continuing to perform the routines of the front, stand-to, inspections, the maintenance activities that had structured their days, not because they were ordered to, but because the routines were what they knew how to do, and the space left by the absence of the routines was not yet filled by anything else. The armies of the First World War eventually demobilized. The men went home. They returned to the civilian lives that the war had interrupted, or they attempted to return to them, or they constructed new civilian lives in the place of the ones that had ended or changed beyond recognition while they were away. The institutions that had managed them through the war issued final pay and official documents and in some cases small gratuities, and the men dispersed, and the institution's obligation to them, in the institution's understanding of what obligation meant, was largely complete. There were pensions for the physically disabled. There was almost nothing for the psychologically disabled because the category of psychological disability had been so aggressively minimized by the institution during the war that the infrastructure for addressing it in the peace did not exist and in many cases was not built. And men who had carried the adaptations of the front home with them discovered that the civilian world had no protocol for what they were carrying and no particular desire to develop one, because the civilian world was also managing a narrative about the war that required the narrative of the soldier as simply changed by the war rather than broken by it, because the alternative framing had implications that the society that had sent those men was not prepared to reckon with. The war had lasted 4 years and 3 months. It had involved 65 million mobilized soldiers from 30 countries. It had produced a landscape of approximately 700 kilometers of continuous fortification that altered the surface of the earth in ways still visible from the air over a century later. It had developed, tested, and institutionalized technologies of killing, including artillery, chemical weapons, aircraft, armored vehicles, and machine guns used in specific configurations that were subsequently improved and deployed in the next war, which began 21 years after the armistice. The medical and psychiatric knowledge developed in managing the casualties of the First World War was applied in the Second World War with somewhat greater systematic attention, though the gap between what was known and what was done remained large. The routines described here, the stand-to and the dead and the rats and the gas and the letters and the leave and the return from leave, were not the exceptional features of the war. They were the ordinary features of the war. They were the features that 4 years of continuous exposure made normal for the men inside them. The war's achievement was not its violence. Its achievement was the normalization of its violence, the production of an institution efficient enough to absorb 10 million deaths and keep functioning, to absorb 20 million wounded and keep processing them, to absorb the complete psychological destruction of a significant portion of an entire generation of men from multiple continents and nations, and to record that destruction in files and reports and medical journals and form letters, and to keep the line staffed and the rotation running, and the paperwork moving from desk to desk and out tray to in tray in an unbroken flow that continued until the political decision to stop it was made, and then stopped, and then was filed.